All right. Hello. Test one, two. Yes. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brandon Telg. I am the co-chair of UCG's Open and Affirming Committee, and I'm really excited to be introducing today's seminar. There is a series of seminars over the course of this year that ONA is working towards helping to curate, given where we are currently in the world of LGBTQ plus related issues and how much this space is under fire. We're really excited to provide. Sorry, I'm looking at this insect that's flying. I didn't mean to like that caught my attention. um, Sorry. Yeah, we're excited to provide educational opportunities on all kinds of things in this sort of larger educational space. So today's seminar is being brought to us by Gina Marks. Gina is someone who studied this space of masculinities in graduate school. And currently, if you are someone who goes to the Lynx bookstore regularly, you might recognize Gina as one of the folks who works there. And without further ado, here is Gina with Masculinities and Why They Matter.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks for indulging my very nerdy hyperfixations today. So a little bit about me before we get started. Hello, my name is Gina Marks. My pronouns are they, she. Is it on? Is it on? Okay, cool. There we go. Let me know if you need me to move it. Hello, my name is Gina Marks. My pronouns are they, she. I have a master's degree in English, literature, media, and cultural studies. I have the first semester of a PhD in the same program, and then I dropped out because I decided I wanted to go work in book world instead, which is why I'm at the Lynx. I like to call myself a recovering academic. No shade to anybody who is a current academic, but these kinds of seminars are actually what I was really drawn to in leaving the world of academia. It felt like a very insular space. It felt like I wasn't able to have the meaningful, more community engaging conversations that I was really invested and interested in having. And so I left because I was sitting in my PhD courses, thinking about how much I would rather be working at my bookstore job up in Tallahassee at Midtown Reader, having book clubs on books like American Psycho, and thinking about how those speak to a very specific moment of gender and sexuality and identity and race and all of these very complicated things, and how books really let us have those conversations. So thanks for being here. Thanks for indulging me. And thanks for learning more about this very weird and complicated topic that I didn't even know I was into until grad school. So why the plural? Why is it masculinities and not masculinity? So I wanted to start with a little group exercise. What comes to mind when you hear the word masculinities? What are some of those pluralities? What do you think of with masculinity?
Soft loaded.
Fair enough. Power. A lot of that.
And that's what? That's
Okay, so we have testosterone. I know I'm in the way of the whiteboard. I will move. We have power. I really like power. All right, what else do we have? Arrogance. I'll put that under power. All right, what else? Dominance. I feel like that goes with power as well.
and bulging muscles.
Bulging muscles. I'll put that under testosterone, more biological ideas.
Ability.
Ah, there we go. Yes, this is my plant. Tenderness. There we go. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. I love that. No, Western cowboy masculinity, so very much so. Boys. Marlboro Man. I think I spelled that. Yes. humanity, strength. Yes. Gentle. Love it. Football. Yes, very much privilege. We will definitely get into that. I never remember how to spell privilege. I think that's right. If it's not, don't yell at me. I have too many degrees in English for this. I always add the D. That's that pun. Well, I mean, that's topical. It's all right. Okay, yeah. Was there anything I missed? Dads, brothers, and sons.
Protective. Expectations. Okay.
Expectations, absolutely. And then protection, right? We're running out of room. Protectiveness.
You need a bigger lighting.
I know. Stoicism. Oh, I have all the thoughts on that. My husband will tell you. Anything else that we want to add to our crowded whiteboard? Here. Testosterone, turn up. All righty. Yeah. Bravery. I love it. Bravery. Let's see where we've got room.
Chivalry.
Chivalry. Okay. I feel like that's a really good list. So, so now that we have our list, and hopefully it's legible, I know I write kind of small and I know we don't have a giant space that we're working with, but the main trend that I'm seeing is we have social expectations and then we have biological expectations, right? So we've got the biological, we've got the testosterone, the muscles, the hair. We've got kind of that already all grouped together. And now everything else, I mean, strength, there's an argument, kind of goes back to testosterone, right? And then just about everything else feels pretty social to me, right? These are, I really like, I'm not sure who said expectations, but thank you for that. That was a really excellent contribution. But we have clearly, as we've kind of laid out here, a lot of expectations. And they don't all like necessarily build on each other, do they? There's a lot of divergence here. We have gentle strength, specifically, we have tenderness. And then we also kind of have this idea of like violence almost that's very tied to masculinity. We have privilege, which is this kind of inherently built-in social thing that we've attached to this identity system. And then at the same time, we have dads, brothers, and sons. There's so many expectations that we place on those roles. These are very much familial roles that we have built socially. We have stoicism, which is a whole philosophical world. And then I really like, actually, Brandon, that you brought up the cowboys, because I find the cultural representations to be some of the most important things in how we think about masculinity, in how we talk about that. Because this cowboy is attached to some really specific expectations, isn't it? The cowboy is attached to this chivalry, the bravery, the power, not so much to the fragility, not so much to the tenderness. You know, so we have very different expectations kind of attached to all of these things. So already we're getting into this plurality. So this field of study is very intentional. It does not like masculinity. It is not singular. Masculinity, I mean, gender is not a singular experience. This is why we have these ongoing conversations about like, I mean, we all know what's happening in politics right now. We're all here talking about this because we know what's happening in politics right now. We are watching trans people being aggressively marginalized and attacked. We are watching queer people be aggressively marginalized and attacked because we have decided that gender and sex are the same and that people can be shoved into these little boxes, right? That masculinity is inherently one thing and that if you are a man, you are in that box. That's very clearly not true, right? nobody's experiences are going to be the same. So my favorite theory that I always draw from is Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. Some of you guys might be familiar with that. She is a phenomenal Black scholar who has done incredible work in academia. She founded this idea of intersectionality and talks about how just by the very nature of things existing, there are too many variables to ever completely separate something into a black and white world, right? So a Black man is going to have a very different experience of masculinity from a white man. A trans man is going to have a very different experience of masculinity from a cisgender man. All of these things come into play. Race is very strong in that. Gender is very strong in that. Sexual identity is very strong in that. And these things all pile on top of each other, right? So very plural, very masculinities, right? Another fun fact about the field is that we really don't like toxic masculinity as a concept. So I'm a little surprised nobody said that. Somebody always says that when I talk about this stuff. But there's a lot of baggage attached to that term, right? Like we have this very complicated relationship to this gender identity, and then we're adding the word toxic to it. So it kind of already implies that you're starting off from this really caustic place. You maybe have bad intentions. You maybe have like, you're already put into this box of bad and negative, and it doesn't really give you as much room to grow and think more about these things like the tenderness, the humanity, the chivalry, the support, like the family values. So if we're putting people in this box, you know, we're already kind of off to a complicated start, right? So very, very plural, very complicated. I could talk your ear off about that for hours. So why does this especially matter right now? We've already talked a little bit about the political state. We're having all of these ongoing conversations. It feels like culturally we're not having enough, at least maybe in my very hyper-specific interest opinion, we're maybe not having enough of a conversation about these pluralities and about these different experiences. And we're trying to boil things down into these little tiny boxes. So I'm so sorry for this. Whoop. This is where we're gonna. I'm so sorry. I know I hate it too. It makes me so upset. But I also find it so fascinating. It gets my brain going. Our current moment is actively and intentionally weaponizing masculinity. I think we all see this. We're weaponizing gender. We are especially weaponizing masculinity. Literally weapons in both of these. And this was just the first example that pops up on Google when you search Trump's stupid effing trading cards, right? Like, it's crazy. So, all right, what do we see here? Yeah. Cowboy. Yes, we've got the cowboy already. We've got that cowboy hat. We've got the weapons. What was that? Yes. Military. There's a lot of masculinity attached to the military, isn't there? Yeah. Violent superhero concept. Yep. Absolutely. Fake news. It is fake. I'm pretty sure he made these with AI. Like, these are NFT tokens. Like, they tried to sell these as like those online tokens that go for thousands and thousands of dollars just so you can say you own it. You don't own. Anyway, that's a different question about cybersecurity. But so we have, this is conveying a really specific image, right? It's power, it's dominance, it's assertiveness, it's violence, right? There's a lot to unpack here. And this is unfortunately our president, right? So what does that say to, yeah, not yes, but we've reached a really interesting cultural head, haven't we? Where somebody who does things like this, I don't know how many of you guys saw the Trump Gaza AI video. Like, this stuff is ongoing. This is continual. This is constantly being created. This is constantly being pushed out into the world. My theory is that he's got a whole little team of 17-year-old Elon Musk fanboys who make all of his media for him and push it out into the world. That's my best guess. But we have trading cards for our president, not my president, but you know, for the president of this country that we live in. So it's very specifically an American moment of masculinity that we're in, right? I'm so sorry. We're gonna look at some bad things today. So sorry. Fun fact, this is a flag you can buy on Amazon for $20 to put on your wall. Teenage boys on the internet are going on to Amazon and buying these. College boys are putting these up in their dorm rooms. I've seen them on TikTok. I've seen it myself. It is happening. It's very unfortunate. I think the first time I saw it, I had to stop and pause the video because it was just in the background and I was like, oh, like what have we come to? So how many of these people do we recognize? Does anybody? Obviously we've got Trump, obviously we've got Musk. Do we know who these two guys are? Do you know who this guy is? This is Jordan Peterson. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And this is Andrew Tate. You know, I love this. Yes, this is Andrew Tate and this is his brother Tristan. Yeah. Yes. So we're just going to go down our little list of creatures in this picture. We've got this, it's almost like a god, like a pantheon of terrible internet male figures here that we have. So for those of you who don't know Jordan Peterson, I envy you. He wrote a book called 12 Rules for Life, and it's supposed to be 12 Rules for Life. So this is a self-help book, very intentionally marketed towards young men, right? It's drivel. I've tried to read it. I could not get through it. Like, I thought I'd at least be interested from my academic standpoint. He can't write. He's an academic. He's a PhD in psychology, I believe. He's also like a YouTuber. Very much exists in this online manosphere community. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the manosphere. I am unfortunately very. So he is a figurehead of masculine self-help, like this is how you do it, this is what you should do, this is your 12 rules for life. Let me break life down to you in 12 rules so that you can figure out, navigate this crazy world, whatever. It's terrible. He, fun fact, went on the carnivore diet for a few years, literally only ate beef, salt, and water. Which is very, obviously we've got an interesting attachment of gender identity to that, right? And like men dominating nature, only eating meat, like this very, very domineering idea, and we're taking that even into the diet. Then he had 1 cup of apple cider and he went into a coma. So actively harming himself and actively like this happened fairly publicly and nobody had, like, the news didn't cover it, at least that I saw. I learned about this on a podcast. I mean, like, I feel bad for him a little, but you chose a very interesting life path, and these things happen publicly, and he still has little gaggles of online teen boys who just love him and think of him as this, like, philosophic, like, god figure to model their lives after. So very interesting. For those of you who don't know, also very envious of you. Andrew Tate and his brother, they were actually just before this presentation, like a week or 2 ago, released from their prison in Romania and brought back to the United States by Trump himself. A very specific decision to make because they were in jail for sex trafficking. They had women locked in their basement and that they were repeatedly assaulting. That's why they were in jail. And this man took his presidential power, picked them up from their prison in Romania, and brought them back to the United States. Before that happened, they were very big on the internet. He, like Andrew Tate especially, he's kind of this figurehead. He puts on this very cool guy, tough guy persona. He does like MMA boxing sometimes, very, 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 very showy. His entire persona is like, look at all of my expensive cars, look at this money, look at my big house, look at this. It's this very curated performance of wealth and masculinity and violence. And he was assaulting women and locking them in his basement with his brother, and now he's back in the country. Hilariously, the one thing that DeSantis did recently that I was like interesting about was he said that he doesn't want Andrew Tate anywhere in the state, which I don't either. Keep him away from everyone, put him back in the Romanian jail. But it was a little interesting. I was surprised because DeSantis has his own mess. We could talk about his boots for hours. So also very interesting figures to idealize. And this is a very specific curation, right? Yeah, we have the gambling, we have the cigars, we have the cool guy, we have the expensive suits, we have the glasses. It's a specific presentation of wealth and ostentatiousness and power and like boys club, locker room, that kind of vibe. And then we have our least favorite people on the planet, at least mine, Elon Musk and Donald Trump. One thing that I want to talk about with Elon Musk is that recently his trans daughter has accused him of using IVF to only have male children. And so she feels that a large part of his rage of her being trans comes from, you are a consumer product that I paid for. I bought you to be a boy, and now you're not, and I want a refund. That is, according to her, I mean, he hasn't said that publicly himself, but you know what? He does only have boys. He does only have boys. Yeah, and he has like 12 children. Yeah. 14, yes, yeah. Yeah, it's the 14 now, I think, is what we're hearing. Yeah, 14 children. They were all born boys. One of those is a daughter because she transitioned, like who is a trans daughter, right? So that's not really how statistics work. So I'm like, you know what? Yeah, I would absolutely believe that. Do I have proof? No. Does anybody have 14 boys? Not even the Duggars did, right? Like, come on. So what does that mean? What does that mean if we're out here curating our bloodline of 14 children and we're only having boys? That sure is an interesting, yeah, I was actually having a conversation with my mom about this, and she thinks that he's afraid of dying and this is his attempt at immortality. Which, you know what, between the brain chips and having 14 boys, yeah, I would believe that, yeah.
I can see why you thought more than one thing.
I mean, that's fair. His parents are, woo, yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later. And then we've already talked a little bit about our least favorite person in the world. But he's at the centerpiece, right? He is like the godhead of this display, of this table. And I mean, we've seen him go online and call himself a king. We've seen him go online and do all of these things. And he is putting himself, well, I mean, he didn't put himself, he didn't make this flag, I assume. That would be impressive. But we have created an interesting culture where things like this are made and then sold on Amazon, where anybody can just Google like Trump flag or like, you know, Jordan Peterson, and this is what comes up. You spend $20 on this and you put this on your wall. And you're a 17, 18-year-old boy who's just off at college for the first time, right? What does that mean? So, yeah.
Finger in front of his chicken.
Question. Yeah. Well, like, I actually don't know. I hadn't thought about that. I would imagine it's something like that, like a silence, like I'm the head, I'm the power head here. Like, you guys shut up, you listen to me. I make the rules, you do as I say. So like, even among this buffet of terrible creatures, I am still putting myself here in this position of power. And I mean, I don't know, it's almost very like grab him by the pussy, you know, like that kind of harkening back. Yeah, stick his nose. I like that better. All righty. How many of you guys have read this book? Isn't it a great book? It's one of my very favorites. You guys should read this. This book rocks. This is written by the daughter of a minister who grew up, I think, Presbyterian minister. She is still a practicing Christian. This is her incredibly thoroughly researched documentation of the intentional weaponization of the evangelical culture and how that got attached to conservatism and right wing and the alt-right. Fascinating stuff. So we'll talk a little bit about this. This book opens with the "I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose any voters" quote. So that's where we start. This is a specific looking at an evolution of culture between these two converging parallel forces and how inextricable Christianity has kind of become in our modern ideas of masculinity. So it's very much about cultural evangelicalism. I'm glad that you brought up the cowboy again, Brandon, because we have John Wayne, who is like the cowboy figure. So these basically she goes and says, so basically she goes and says that cultural evangelicalism has kind of like converged in a moment when there was a moment of tension with masculinity. So she really starts a little bit before the Vietnam War, and which was a very considered emasculating war for our sense of Americanism and identity and the gender that's kind of attached to that. Jimmy Carter was seen as this weak political figure, and it really opened the floor to the strong, rugged Christian evangelical figure, and that's how we got Ronald Reagan. So Reagan's coming into power really laid the groundwork for how we got here. This is her argument, which I 100% believe. And so the funniest part about that is that Carter was the evangelical Christian. Reagan was not. He was not at all. I mean, we could keep tracing it back to Nixon and everything, and like, you know, it was very much, but it was this continued cultural build. And then all of a sudden we have this moment that almost feels like a crisis of masculinity with losing this war, with this very masculinized idea of the military. And so all of a sudden there's almost this power vacuum. So we're going to pull in Ronald Reagan, who is very charismatic. He's a TV star. He is the John Wayne of American politics, essentially, is kind of where she takes this. And yeah, so very, very complicated, very interesting. I highly, highly, highly recommend that book. It's a very easy read too. But then she gets into the really intentional embracing of militant masculinity and like the war god and like warrior Jesus depictions and all of these things, how heavily gendered churches really got and how this was all kind of happening at the same moment. So we have Reagan taking this and kicking off this political power structure. All of a sudden abortion is a partisan argument. All of a sudden it's got like these religious connotations in a new political way. And so we have militant masculinity very much bleeding now into the churches and like the warrior church. And so now, a few years down the line, we've got some generations of kids, right? We have families raising their children in these environments. We have families that are, you know, like, I mean, obviously not this church, but churches. I mean, this is why you come to this church and not other churches, because this still happens in other churches. And so we have new generations of young Christian men being told that they need to be violent, they need to be strong, they need to be the providers at all costs, idealizing this. I mean, imagine the flag is back up. Idealizing those figures. And you know what? Trump is about the most unchristian man I can think of, as I'm sure we all kind of feel in this room. But we've attached culturally a Christianity to him and to his masculinity and to the masculinity of all of these figures. And like, again, like keeping women locked in your basement, about the most unchristian thing I can imagine doing. Threatening sexual assault, threatening to shoot people in the middle of the street, not Christian values. But because of this ongoing cultural build, these things have merged. They have become this weird soup, right? So masculinity is they keep trying to boil it down. We're boiling it down, we're essentializing, which is also the danger of all of this biological essentialism we keep running into with this. Like, if we're deciding like, oh, you have a penis, so therefore you have to be this violent Christian powerhouse, right? What does that mean? Like, we're equating all of these social expectations with biology when it's not. And like we talked a little bit about earlier with like Elon Musk's family, like obviously these people if we trace it back, we can see kind of these family dynamics in these figures that we had up here before. Trump's dad was horribly abusive to him. He was an alcoholic. So Trump is like still dead sober to this day, as far as he says. And like very clearly, this has deeply affected him. So it's almost like it's not almost like we can see actually, like looking back into these family cycles, the building and the perpetuation of all of these cultural values and how those get passed down and how those get pushed down. Same for Elon with his emerald mine, blood mine owning colonizer family in South Africa and then emigrating here. The whole thing. So to wrap up all of that bananas, bonkers, webbiness before we move into questions. My very favorite book in the world and movie in the world is Fight Club. This is my Fight Club tattoo. I love it. The first rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club, right? I wrote a whole thesis in my master's. That was my capstone for my master's class, about how Fight Club is actually this very nuanced breaking down of white masculinity and white queer masculinity in the 90s, because this book was actually written by a gay man surviving the AIDS epidemic. A lot of people don't know that. And this creature of Tyler Durden is this very, very intentionally idealized model of masculinity that gets tied into all these things. I could talk here about Fight Club all day, every day. But the first rule of Fight Club, as we all have kind of internalized from our cultural conversations about this, is that you do not talk about Fight Club. We don't talk about masculinity, do we? We don't have these conversations. That's the first time I've ever been invited to come speak to people. Like we are having a little bit of a conversation now, but it's because it's being shoved in our faces. It's because of those Trump cards. It's because of that flag. It's because of all of this violence being enacted against trans people and queer people, because these are things that threaten the essential mold, right? So we got here on purpose, right? If we read that book, if we keep thinking back on all of those evolutions of politics and how aggressively and intentionally that was tied to evangelical culture and all of these things, you can see that. If you look at like voting records, you can see how many evangelical, like self-identified evangelical people voted for Trump and how many people in these spaces are Trumpers. And like, it's a very intentional culture. The manosphere is a whole other creature that we do not have time to dig into today. For those of you who don't know about that, it is how academics and lay people also speak about the online men's internet culture. So it's like 4chan and 8chan, it's Reddit. It's all of these spheres of influence where people like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate are being consumed and being fed by the algorithm to especially young boys. So this is like teenagers getting on the internet and then all of a sudden they're on an Andrew Tate video and he's out here talking about how you need to abuse your girlfriend, right? So it's a very slippery slope. It's a very dangerous place. And we're not doing enough about that. But it also very much comes out of this culture, right? So, which is interesting because it's also like everyone just about in that culture really distances themselves from Christianity, very intentionally, very like atheistic, agnostic, like aggressively. But then it comes full circle and it's very racist, like explicitly. There's some really awful terms on there. It's incredibly misogynistic. That's where Charlottesville came from, was those kinds of internet online Nazi communities. And there's so much gender to talk about there. This is ongoing. If you are curious about that, I have another book recommendation. It's called The Black Pill by Elle Reeve, or Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates. Those are both journalists who did work on this. The Black Pill was about online Nazi platforms and Charlottesville specifically. She was actually at the Charlottesville rally when it happened and interviewed Nazis that were there. And Men Who Hate Women is an online journalist who was kind of like chronicling her longtime experiences of hate campaigns that she's had ongoing against her as a female journalist writing about men. What can we do? We talk about Fight Club. We talk about masculinity. We come to places like this. We build communities. We open dialogues. We have conversations. We give kids who are being targeted by these manosphere groups and algorithms, spaces to come ask questions about that before they get sucked down the rabbit hole and are all of a sudden spewing the worst thing you've ever heard to their female classmates. We need to build intentional relationships of care and community and have ongoing, open conversations. If you want another book about that. Oh gosh, what's it called? Yeah, Turn This World Upside Down, Nora Samaran. I thought I had written that down and I had not. That one's great. It's an essay with like interviews that comes with it, but very much about how the opposite of rape culture is care culture and nurturance culture. But yeah, so that's what I have for you guys. Thanks for listening to my spiel. Would love to chat about questions, comments, all of the above.
To me, the great irony of this masculine Christianity is that the arrogance, the domination, the abuse, etc., is 180 degrees opposite of the teachings of Jesus.
Yes.
Blessed are the peacemakers, the meek, love your enemies, do good to those that, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So how did... It's hard for me to understand how this John Wayne Christianity evolved,
right?
Given that it's just basically the opposite of the teachings of Jesus.
Yes. So my understanding, mind you, it's been a couple months since I've read the book, but my memory and understanding in my research has always been that it was the politicization aspect very much because it was coming in this moment of war and this moment of masculine kind of crisis in American culture. It was like, oh, but Jesus says, like, it was really hammering down on like the provide for your family, like the like be the figurehead, like taking those those Bible passages of like your wives should submit and things like that, pulling those out of those contexts, taking those out and putting them into these conversations of control and kind of shaping the narrative. So it was intentional, and it was because of the political framework that the pieces of Christianity were being hand selected and pulled out into. So
I was going to say, if you really want to hear some of things that will chill your bones, listen to Josh McPherson. Mm-hmm. He is that toxic masculine. He says that the worst combination for a family is a Jezebel spirit woman with an Ahab spirit husband. And, he preaches, you got to get a hold of your women. You got to control them. Anyway, Josh McPherson.
Yeah.
I haven't read anything he's written, but I've watched some of his videos. And Jesus and John Wayne is a really good history book of how this branch of Christianity evolved.
I think a lot of it to that point also is like really the celebritization of Christianity figures, like the Joel McPhersons, like Josh McPherson's, like the Joel Osteens, like those kinds of very like televangelistic figureheads, taking those pieces and then just blasting them outside of context. Yeah.
Following up on that, I have a question. How you talk about the politicization as the means for, or the reason, the motivation for this current culture of masculinity being so only a part of the masculine physique. I'm wondering, on your opinion, how much of that do you think was reactionary to women's lib and women's rights? Yes,
very much so. I mean, it was really like a perfect little soup of this moment where it was really open. There was so in the 1970s, there was a movement called the Mythopoetic Men's Movement that was actually very intentionally reactionary to like, well, second wave feminism is happening and women are having these conversations, and what about us? Like, we aren't having conversations about change, which like was very well intended and spoke to, I think, a lack of positive role models and positive identity structures and positive communities for men. And in that vacuum, it built up these very isolated bubbles of these little echo chambers where that really kind of started bouncing off. But yes, I think it was absolutely reactionary. It was reactionary to so many things. It was reactionary to like Vietnam. It was reactionary to women's rights, women's liberation movements. It made the lack of positive identity structures and communities very clear to men, I think. And I think it made it very clear that there was an opportunity to build up a culture and put a model in that gap that got twisted and turned into what we have now. So
it's all very dystopian. And what I'm wondering is not just where it came from, but what the alternative is, because it seems like, these people are taking up all the space, all the air in the room. Where is the Nelson Mandela type person who, to me, would be an example of a modern masculinity to aspire to? I know they must be out there, but I feel like they're being silenced by just the noise.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, no, to your point, I mean, like thinking about the manosphere and the algorithms and everything happening, it's intentional. We have Mark Zuckerberg building algorithms built on outrage and emotional reaction. And so that feeds into the Jordan Petersons and the Trumps and the Andrew Tates of the world. We're going to need some change on that side of things, I think, to really allow for more platforming. But, I think what I feel like is really important is building local communities, finding local positive representations of identity structures, having good father figures, uncles, older community members, whatever that looks like for you, and having that and having them be resources and having them have ongoing open conversations with you. I think that is where we have the most power to really build positive models and positive relationships without having to, we can't change the structures overnight, obviously, but we can change the people around us. You guys can come to these meetings, we can have these conversations, you can ask these questions, and we can do this, right? Nobody can stop us from doing this, at least for now. So, we can go lobby with Equality Florida like Brandon's gonna do on Tuesday. We can do these things at the local level. We can do the stuff that's in front of our faces and have people come into those spaces here for our kids and our families. Yeah.
So I can understand how this crap happened with some number of people, but I don't understand how it happened with over half of the population in America that voted for that guy, and how it happened for so many congregations of evangelical churches.
Yep.
How do we blame it all on the internet?
I think the internet is a large part. It is not everything. I think the danger, especially of the churches and how the churches became as corrupted in this way as they are, is because they are community spaces. And if you're noticing a community vacuum, but you have your church community, then you're going to gravitate towards your church, right? So if you feel like you have a community here, then you're gonna go put more energy into that. You're gonna build that out more. You're gonna keep that going. And so when you have enough people in this environment, and then you get one bad pastor or one bad leader, it trickles up almost, I feel like. But I think the church was weaponized as much as it was because of the community space.
I would like to follow a little bit up on Suzanne's question about feminism. I'm a basic scientist, and when I went to school, there was a clear distinction between what girls were taught and what boys were taught. And when my own daughter went to school, it was almost a little bit the reverse, that the education was more catered towards girls being given the opportunity to learn about science and to become math masters and so forth, right? And so, and a lot of the education kind of left boys behind a little bit because they're not embroidering their essays with flowers and stuff like that, that my daughter liked to do, right? And so they got a grade lower because of that. So it always seems to me like the pendulum swings from one extreme to the next. And then the reaction is, the counter reaction is so extreme. And this is a country of extremists. And on both sides.
Yep.
And it is so disturbing to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I was actually just listening to a podcast episode. If you guys like podcasts, there's a book podcast called If Books Could Kill. The most recent one was on Of Boys and Men by, I think, Reeves was the name of the author. I have not read the book, but I have a copy of it and have had it for a few years because obviously I picked it up. But it actually, part of the episode did speak on that issue. And so I feel like what they talked about in that was like, you know, school used to be very exclusively.
Weird. But I don't have the guest membership anymore. I have the sheep membership. You can't go to the gym now.
Oh, it's the Zoom. I see. Yeah. No.
Martha, could you mute your mic, please?
No worries. That's okay. I'm glad people are watching. But yeah, so part of the conversation in this podcast was about schools. And so, you know, school used to be like FSU used to be like a women's school, or, you know, like those schools were very gendered and separated. And it was very much a men's world. And then all of a sudden, women had to kind of fight their way into education. We had this movement of like all of these women going to school. Now more women have college degrees than men. There's been a big cultural shift in that way. But there's still like, you know, all the complications of the gender pay gap. So what does it mean that women are more educated than men, but men are still making more money? And I think to your point, it is because schools have kind of evolved to cater here. And so, yeah, now we're leaving boys behind. And I think that feeds only further into this because now we're leaving boys behind and there's another vacuum that needs to be filled. So if they're not feeling like they're intellectually stimulated, the false academic of Jordan Peterson sure becomes a lot more appealing, right? Like he uses the big words, he uses the jargon so much you can't even understand what he's saying. But if you're not having the same access to education and to resources to have those more explicit academic, more nuanced conversations, there's that vacuum as well. So then that becomes a whole other very reactionary. It opens up that space for even further extreme reaction. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just one real quick question. You mentioned the poetic movement in the 70s. Yes. Robert Bly?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was thinking Robert Bly was cool, and it was good that they had this masculinity discussion. But then what happened again?
So it started with very good intentions. Yes, it was this movement. It was a little odd. There was a lot of Native American appropriation that happened. They were like doing drum circles in the woods. Yeah, but it was the first time that there had ever been an attempt at a positive, like, American masculinity movement. So I think it was a really good idea, a really good starting point. Like, men do deserve to have these positive communities. Men do deserve to build connections that are meaningful with other men. But I think because there wasn't a strong enough framework and it just kind of snowballed culturally in this moment where there was so much vulnerability, that's how it got pretty corrupted. I think there wasn't enough, like, because there had never really been a conversation, I think, meaningfully culturally about what it looks like to be a good man. There's not a starting point where you can kind of take it and move forward. So then all of the negative things happen and you're like kind of piecing together from your experiences that are happening under this culture. That's only like, and now all of a sudden you're getting fed all of these negative ideas and being pushed further in these ways. So yeah.
I want to actually take a second and share a personal perspective on some of the things that we've talked about. I've heard a lot of questions around how does evangelical Christianity do what they're doing, mm-hmm. right? Why is it that people are going along with it, or how did it change? And I want to say that I personally grew up in a Southern Baptist church here in Gainesville. And so much of what you were talking about was the water that I was swimming in, to the point that I didn't know any different, right? Like, the thing that is different about UCG than any church I had exposure to growing up is that a lot of people, there are multi-generational families here, but most of the people that I interact with here at UCG found UCG as an adult, and they're looking for a thing. Most of, and I'm using blanket statements here, but most of the families that I interacted with in the evangelical space that I grew up in were multi-generational families who went to a church, either the same church or a church, an evangelical church, much like the one that we were at. And so you have, if indeed the split happened in Jimmy Carter Reagan's presidency and not before, and there's arguments to be said that it's much longer than that,
Much longer.
then you have at minimum 2 to 3 generations, even by the time I was growing up, that all they knew was this newer form of evangelicalism. And so all that to say, like, coming from even the best intentioned perspective, and things have gotten, as I understand, a hell of a lot worse since I left the church that I grew up in as a young man. But the entire ecosystem of this church is, you have someone at the top telling you that God is saying, this is how it is, and very rigid, masculine structured family dynamics. Everything in the church reinforces that, because all of the material that you're teaching comes from a book that you've ordered from some company that creates evangelical like literature.
It's a whole industry.
Right. And so at a certain point, when you're growing up to say, this is what being a son looks like, this is what being a father looks like, and you're being fed a version of Jesus who is somehow both like a badass fighter, which is not the Jesus that I have come to understand from reading the Bible as an adult, a badass fighter, and also somehow like sits down and talks with the kids, the lion and the lamb, which is, a very extreme version of that. What you're left with is this John Wayne version of what it is to be a man. And so I say all this to say that this is, it took me many years of unlearning, because this is what I thought it was to be a person in this world. Right. So I can sympathize certainly with where this generation of men, boys, father figures are, if this is the world that they grew up in and never had a chance to get out. But I say all this to say it's very complicated, and I can see how it has gotten to where it is from my own personal lived experience.
Yeah, well, the frog doesn't notice that the pot is starting to boil if the frog is born into the boiling pot, right? You don't see it. If that's your entire world in these evangelical communities, as many of you know, probably from personal experiences of growing up in those communities, that's all you know. If you go to Christian school, that's everyone you go to school with. If you go to church that's everyone you know. That's your neighbors. That's your community. That is your entire community. And so if everyone around you thinks these things and is telling you these stories and is sharing these experiences, why would you ever think differently? You don't have a reason to, because that's your world. So.
Interesting quote in Newsweek recently where Elon Musk's biographer said that he told him his most important life lesson he learned from video games, and that was that empathy is not an asset. That blew my mind.
That sounds like he was playing a lot of only online Call of Duty. Yep.
One real quick statement is a lot of the evangelical movement was also connected with wealth.
Yes.
And if we believe in this way, we will be rewarded with money. We're talking capitalism at its worst.
Yes. No, capitalism. You cannot have these conversations about gender without talking about capitalism. I didn't gigantic pot, which is why we didn't dig super into it in the presentation. But yes, wealth and power are inextricable. And when you are attaching power to a gender identity, you have to think about that. Again, gender pay gap exists for a reason. This, like Elon Musk being this incredibly wealthy creature is, yeah, like they are not, you can't talk about them separately. Yeah. Because they grew up in the church and they grew up in their rural communities. Yep. I know. It's like, come on, please. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that some of this discussion about the church, I mean, in 300, when it became the Christian faith became the Church of the State, Christianity has been attached to power.
Yes.
And its return
yes.
shouldn't surprise us. I mean, Christianity was the basis of, there was the Inquisition, the Crusades,
yep.
Colonization was tied to Christianity and faith and saving the heathen, and as a basis of colonizing. And I mean, I saw the same thing, not the same thing. I saw in the church I was raised in, which was Southern Baptist. But when I was a child, the Southern Baptist Church stayed away from politics because politics was dirty. And what I have since seen among some of my family and is that they were convinced then that their duty was to become political, and people of power convinced them that certain things, like you must become politicized because babies are being killed in abortions,
yes.
and the queers are going to take over the world, and it was those fears were yes. As far as masculinity, to some degree, masculinity has always been attached to power.
Yes.
There was a brief attempt to interrupt that among the feminist movement. And then this is, I think, just an embrace of it again and a return. And what I'm saying is, in some level, it shouldn't be a surprise.
No.
It's been happening before. The clothing is different and the tools are different. And the one major tool are those algorithms.
Yes.
And also, while that is simultaneously happening, certain structures in the community, and you mentioned the community level, are being are weakened,
exactly.
And God help us.
God help us.
Or the goddess help us.
No, absolutely. I mean, like the church very much has always been attached to power, and Christianity is probably always been the main face of that, at least in the West, and it's always been attached to our country. We just pretended to have the separation of church and state for a while, so.
I'm wondering if you look at all the independently developed civilizations of history and of maybe currently, like tribes in Africa or ones in Brazil, which have never been contacted by anybody. Is it not the rule that usually the men run things?
Sometimes there are lots of matriarchal societies as well. There's also very different, even if the men are still tied to, like, maybe they're the ones hunting or whatever. Like, if you look back, I know less obviously about current groups that we haven't interacted much with in the West. But I know, like, you look back into Native American history and they had these incredibly, like, history, it's still ongoing, but there are these very expansive ideas of gender. There are two-spirit people. There are, like, even if the men are going out and hunting and the women are staying home to cook and provide, the women are, like, there are very matriarchal groups. There are very, like, it's just different. There are still separations, but then there are these very, like, complicated positions that are put into these places. And I mean, like, we can't ignore there are some biological things that are just attached to a lot of people's bodies. So I think naturally there's going to be a lot of, like, the men will generally probably be the ones who are going out and doing the hunting and things like that. But also, like, the power isn't always necessarily attached to that role in the way that we attach it, I think. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So. Yes. Well, thank you all for listening. I love talking about this stuff. Happy to chat if anyone has individual questions as well. I'll be here for a minute.